The European Union has announced sanctions on Iran's security forces over the death of the 22-year-old woman Jina Mahsa Amini last month and the repression of subsequent anti-government protests. EU foreign ministers agreed to target Iran's so-called morality police, in whose hands Amini died, as well as a cabinet minister overseeing internet blockages. The named officials will be subject to EU visa bans and asset freezes.
Support for the protesters and condemnation of the brutal crackdown. EU diplomats gathered in Luxembourg to send a strong message to Iran's leadership.
Today we are making clear that we are taking those responsible who use brutal force against citizens, against women, against men, against teenagers, just because they want to live their life as we do in freedom and peace.
For more than a month now, Iran's leaders have struggled to contain protests sparked by the death of Jina Mahsa Amini after she was arrested by the so-called morality police. The protest quickly morphed into anti-government demonstrations. Activists say some 200 people have been killed. Announcing the new sanctions, the EU's foreign policy chief called on Iran to end the violence, adding that if necessary, the bloc will go further.
The Council adopted today restrictive measures against 11 individuals and 4 entities, targeting those linked to the death of Mahsa Amini and to the repression of peaceful protesters. And if needed, we are ready to add more names to this list.
Iran has vowed an immediate response to the new sanctions.
Such rushed and biased behavior is unacceptable. It's meddling in our domestic affairs. We don't accept this.
As politicians trade accusations, protesters like these students in central Iran continue venting their anger at the authorities, who seem unwilling to listen.
And for more, we can speak to Giso Nia. She's the director of the Atlantic Council's Strategic Litigation Project, focused on accountability for human rights violations. Her area of expertise is rule of law in Iran. Ms. Nia, what do you make of these new EU sanctions? What effect, if any, do you think they'll have?
Well, it's certainly a welcome development. These sanctions on 15 Iranian entities and individuals who are implicated in human rights violations, including Iran's morality police and its law enforcement forces, it's very appreciated because this is the only second such set of human rights designations that the EU has levied against the Islamic Republic since 2013. So human rights lawyers and advocates have long been calling for further designations for human rights violations on top Iranian leadership, and that just hadn't happened until now.
Are there other levers you would like the international community to pull to hold the Iranian government accountable?
Yes, there's a lot that the international community can be doing right now and that the EU and its individual member states can be doing. One is that member states need to immediately call a special session of the UN Human Rights Council. There needs to be a special session to discuss the ongoing human rights crisis in Iran and to discuss the setup of an accountability mechanism that will allow for a repository to streamline the collection and preservation of evidence of violations and to possibly issue reports on the situation. So that is something that the international community and UN member states can do today if they wanted to. An additional thing that they could do is remove the Islamic Republic of Iran from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which is the UN's top women's rights body. They were elected last year, and they started a 4-year term in March 2022. They're going to be there till 2026. A country which has gender discriminatory laws on the books to the severity that the Islamic Republic does should not be allowed to have a leadership position on a UN body like that. An additional thing that can happen. Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
I was going to say additional thing that could happen with respect to these sanctions. So we saw that there are these human rights sanctions that have been issued. It's fine to freeze the assets of the individuals who are implicated in these violations and who are responsible for them. But I also think that EU countries should start considering legislation that allows for the seizure of these assets of chronic human rights violators and transfer from perpetrators to victims, similar to what Canada has done. They recently passed legislation that allows for that repurposing of assets.
Yeah. These protests have been going on for over a month now, and despite the deadly crackdown, they don't appear to be abating. I want to look ahead with you. What is your sense of how this is going to play out?
The Islamic Republic of Iran has successfully squelched out previous protests that have been reoccurring in the country since December 2017. I think what is different here is that young girls, young women have joined these protests. This is about social change. They have joined by taking off their mandatory hijab and peacefully protesting for their rights. I think it becomes much more difficult for state security forces to kill young girls as young as 12, who are protesting for their rights. So that's why we see these protests enduring, and really because the core is, it's about social change. They are demanding social freedoms.
Yeah. Specifically with regard to the fire in the Evin prison, where many protesters are being held, what are you hearing about what's happening there, and how concerned are you about the welfare of the prisoners?
Well, we've been hearing different things. Iranian state media and the judiciary first reported that 40 people were killed in the fire. Then they quickly revised that number to 4. Now they're saying that 8 people have died because an additional 4 succumbed to their injuries. So we don't have a transparent death count. Human rights organizations and citizen journalist collectives are trying to establish the welfare of different individuals, but we should remember that there are lots of political prisoners in Evin. There are human rights lawyers. There are those who are imprisoned just for their peaceful expression of their freedom of expression, association, and assembly, and just for doing their jobs. So this is very critical. The prison is overcrowded right now because the authorities have rounded up a lot of different civil society leaders there. And this really demands the international community's attention, and anybody, any countries that have diplomatic relations with the Islamic Republic should be urging the absolute welfare and release of these prisoners.
Nia with the Atlantic Council, thank you so much.
Thank you.